Funding for this program is provided by this station and by other public television stations.
It's a New England potluck supper tonight, and we've got a marvelous menu. The main course is New England fish chowder, and if you've never had one before, it's just absolutely delicious. It has a most wonderful smell when it's cooking of salt pork slowly cooked with a whole lot of sliced onions and then potatoes and great big chunks of fresh fish, and it really makes a whole meal, and it's just really a great dish, and you don't need much of else with it except maybe a side dish of coleslaw, and then we're going to end with a splendid Indian pudding. And if you've never had one of those before, you'd never know what it was when you ate it. It's a wonderfully brown, caramelized mixture that tastes of molasses and spices and just the good earth, and it's actually made out of cornmeal. And I'm going to do today for you the chowder and the Indian pudding. And actually Indian pudding is, I think, one of the very interesting examples of early American cooking, because when the settlers came here, they brought their cooking methods from the old country, but they used to have puddings in the old country made out of wheat or rye meal. But of course, when they came to America, there wasn't any wheat or rye, so they had to use what was here, which was corn, which they called Indian meal because they got the corn from the Indians. And they started out with corn kernels like these. And if you're going to make the dessert as though you were a pilgrim, you can grind your own corn. And here's a hand corn grinder, the kind you can get in a lot of stores nowadays, and you grind. And it doesn't grind terribly fine, but it does a very good job. Or you can get an attachment to your electric mixer, which grinds rather slow. Or you can get this wonderful super blender, and just listen to this. And you end up with cornmeal, and this is what comes out of the machine. You can grind it as fine or as rough as you want. And of course, you don't have to do any grinding yourself. You can buy a package in your market like that, or you can go to a health food store and get, I'll give you a little bit of each, and get stone ground cornmeal. And I don't think that makes much difference whether it's white or yellow. I'm going to use yellow cornmeal. And I'm going to start out in a nice big pot with half a cup of yellow cornmeal, stone ground. And then it has a quart of milk in it. I've got to turn on my heat here. And then a quart of milk. This is just cold milk, just gradually stirred in. Some people start cornmeal by sprinkling the cornmeal into boiling milk, and I just do it the other way around. I put stir cold milk into the cornmeal, and it works out very nicely. Then you let that come to the boil, and while you're doing it, you put in the rest of the ingredients. And I have here, I'm going to be very pilgrimy today. You could put in 6 to 8 tablespoons of butter. Of course, you can leave all the fat out if you want, but the fat sweetens it up a little bit. And what I'm going to use is beef suet, because that's what was used very much in England, you know, suet pudding. And beef suet is beef fat, but it comes from inside the beef around the kidneys, which is the most beautiful of the fat. It's just like pork leaf lard, which comes from the kidneys. And it makes a lovely, I don't know why I say lovely, but it makes a very nice a nice fat to use because it's very fresh and fine. And you chop it up fine. And we want about, let me get out my recipe card because my mind is like a disposal. We want 4 to 6 tablespoons of butter or of beef suet, and that goes in. Do you remember in the old pilgrimy days, they needed a lot of nourishment. So that's why a lot of the old recipes have quite a bit of fat and lard in them, which of course, as I said, you can leave out. And then we want a tablespoon of ginger. You can use more or less, it depends on your taste. And I happen to like ginger better than any other herbs, and I think it's much more traditionally New Englandy because ginger came from the great sailing ships, and this is be sure that it's a fresh and fragrant. And I use only ginger, but this depends on what you like. And I may say at this point that there are as many recipes for Indian pudding as you could shake a stick at, and everybody says their recipe is the best. And so as I'm doing this recipe, this is the best. Then it has 2 teaspoons of salt. So there we have half a cup, that's half a cup or 1 deciliter of cornmeal, and 1 liter, which would be the same as 1 quart of milk. And now we have the molasses that goes in. And this is unsulfured, dark, best quality, nutritious molasses. And interestingly enough, molasses has a tremendous amount of potassium in it. And that potassium is supposed to be very good for you. I think it has something like 3,000 units per 100 grams, which is a lot. And that's supposed to be very good for you indeed. Now, I think we have everything in that was except a nice big apple. And this apple is a suggestion of Mrs. Lydia Maria Child, who was no relation to me, but she was a very stern but able woman, an early feminist in the 1800s. And she wrote a book called The Frugal Housewife, which, as a matter of fact, has been reprinted in facsimile. You can still get it. And she's the kind of woman that saves every piece of string and every piece of paper. And she told you how to live frugally and well. And her recipe has an apple. It's the only one of the old recipes I've seen that does have it, and I like the idea of it. And also that's a very New Englandy thing. I don't know, after the long cooking that this gets, whether you know, oh, it went in whole, that's too bad. I'll fish it out, scrape it with here. It should be grated. You could put it to a food processor too, but for 1 small apple, I don't think it's worth it. You know, a lot of Indian pudding recipes have eggs in them, but I don't like that. I like a rather stern and rock-bound Indian pudding. Some of them have eggs and then they're not cooked very long. But I think that the Indian pudding has to be long cooking. There's the rest of the apple that goes in. We'll leave this rather messy counter and go over and look at another one. What happens here is you stir it until it comes up to the boil, and then you let it boil until it becomes very thick. It looks like that. It has to be a thick porridge. And you can either boil it, stir it and boil it for about 5 or 6 minutes till it's begun cooking up nicely, or I'm going to turn that off because I'm not over there. And then you can continue on in a pan of water, a bain-marie, or you can stir and cook it over direct heat, which goes quite a bit faster. And as a matter of fact, there's an old way of doing a pudding called a hasty pudding. You've heard of the Hasty Pudding Club in Harvard. But the hasty pudding is when the whole thing is cooked on top of the stove, and it'll probably take you 2 hours of continual stirring. But in this case, I'm going to put it into the oven, into a 2-quart or 2-liter casserole that's been buttered. Then in goes the pudding mix. And then it's going to go into the oven and cook very slowly and long. And the most beautiful Indian puddings cook a very long time, because that is what gives you the wonderful caramel taste of it. So the first part of it is you put it into a 350-degree oven for about half an hour until it begins to bubble up. And when it's bubbled up, it looks like this. See, that's already getting that wonderful caramel-looking quality to it. And then it's going to have 2 milk treatments. And the first one, you put a cup of milk in, and it gets stirred in with a green spoon. That's part of the recipe. You have to stir it rather carefully. It's a little something somewhat sloppy. And then clean off the sides of the pan of your casserole. And then it goes back into the oven, but you turn the oven down to 250 degrees. Because this is going to cook very, very slowly, and you let it cook in the oven for about 2 hours. And then you take it out again. This one I've done it in a larger casserole this time. And then it gets its second milk treatment, in which you stir it all up. You see how that's bubbling there. And then scrape off the sides and scrape around the dish. And then the second milk treatment, the milk just rests on top. It doesn't get stirred in. So pour it over a spoon or a spatula just so it lays there on top. And the reason for this is that it makes a kind of a glaze on the top of the pudding. Now it goes in for its final cooking, and that will last, you should cook it for about 4 hours, very slowly, and keep looking at it. If at 250 degrees it seems to be cooking too fast, turn it down to 225, but it just should very, very slowly cook, and then it will get that marvelously caramel quality. And then all the time that it's cooking there, 6 hours, which it should do, you can be getting to your fish chowder. And so let's now take a look at that fish. You know, you don't have to live in New England to make a New England fish chowder. You can do it anywhere that you can get what the Pilgrims had, which is salt pork, onions, potatoes, all cooked in a wonderful, fragrant fish stock. And you don't even have to have fresh fish. You can use equal parts of canned or bottled clam juice and water. But we got the fish, so we're going to make it in the traditional New England way. And we have the fish to make the stock out of. And what you want is fish frames. Now, here is a fish. This is an enormous cod. And when the fillet is taken off, what you have are just the bones and the head. And here I have a haddock. And this is what you get from the fishmonger. He's taken off as much fish as he can get rapidly. And you've got the head on. You've got quite a bit of meat. And if you have friendly relations with your fish man, you can get these free. You just go in and buy a few shrimp or a sole fillet, and then you say, well, by the way, do you happen to have any fish frames? It's called a frame. And he'll say, oh, sure, if he has them, and give them to you free, so you get your chowder free. And then you can get him to cut it up, or you can cut it up yourself, which I rather like to do. But the first thing you want to be sure is that the gills are taken out. These are gills, sort of googly red things, and they fit in there, and you cut them at the bottom and at the top and just pull them out and throw them away, and then you wash your fish thoroughly, and then you whack him up. Whang! And this, you just whack it up so you can get it into your pot. You've got to have a lot of whacking equipment if you're going to do it yourself. And in it goes to your pot. You can cut the head in half if you want to. You can even take out the eyes, but they give great flavor, so I always leave them in. And then fill it with water. And then all you do is you just set it to simmer on the stove for 20 minutes. And I've got one that's already made on the stove, so we'll go over and take a look at it. Now this has been simmering for 20 minutes and is now officially a fish stock, and it really is the key to a great chowder, I think. And the fish stock goes into a chowder base, and the chowder base consists of salt pork and onions and potatoes and seasonings as well. And there's your salt pork. Take the rind off, dice it, and then blanch it, which means put it into a pan of about a quart of water and let it simmer for 5 minutes, and that takes all the salt out of it. And you want about 6 ounces, which is 180 grams, or about almost a cup or a quarter of a liter. And I put a little bit of oil in the pan, and then you want to stir it around and let it cook a little bit to render out its fat. And then you want to have your onions, and we have about a quart or slightly over a liter or slightly over a quart of sliced onions, and in they go. And in a recipe like this, the exact measurements don't count for a great deal, but you want to have plenty of onions because that's what gives you a wonderful flavor. Stir them all up and cover them and let them cook very slowly until they look like this. See, they're nice and tender and they've rendered their fat. And then I always like to put in a little bit of a liaison, which means a little bit of a flour thickening, because I don't like fish and potatoes to sink down to the bottom of the chowder. So I'm going to put in 3 tablespoons of flour. There's a heaping one, so that's 2 tablespoons and 1 level one. And then stir that all around, get that out of your way. Mix it all up, and then let that cook slowly for about 2 minutes until, because you want to cook the flour, and then you're ready to add your fish stock. And we want 4 cups of fish stock, and you can just strain it right in from the kettle. This ladle holds 1 cup, so put in about 1½ ladles at first, and then stir it all around to be sure that you've mixed your flour up in it. And then you put in the rest of it, about 4 cups, a quart, which is about a liter, more or less. Again, it doesn't make too much difference. Then heat it, stir it up, and bring it up to the boil. And in the meantime, put in your seasonings, which will be 2 bay leaves and a little bit of roughly ground black pepper or white pepper, cracked pepper they sometimes call it, and then some herbs. I like a little bit of sage, about ½ a teaspoon of sage or of thyme, because that flavors it up nicely. But at this point you don't want any salt in, because if the salt pork may still be salty, and if you've used clam juice instead of fish stock, that would be 2 cups of clam juice and 2 cups of water, that already is salted. You just wait and don't salt it yet. Then after it's come up to the boil, you put in your potatoes, and that's about 1½ pounds or almost 3/4 of a kilo of potatoes, which makes about a little over 4 cups again, sliced. And then they cook up until they're nice and soft. And I have one that's already done here. And there you are. And this is your chowder base, and it's all ready for the fish. And I've got the fish in the icebox. And that's one thing you must always remember when you're using fish. Keep it cold. When you're not working on it, put it in the fridge. And I'm going to use about 3.5 pounds here of fish cut into 2-inch chunks. And that goes into your chowder base. And then add a little bit of milk at this point. I'm going to put in some hot milk. And then you want to be very careful that you don't overcook it. This only really, I think, just takes about 3 or 4 minutes just to come up to the simmer and simmer about 2 or 3 minutes. And then at this point, taste it very carefully for seasoning. It smells awfully good already. The onions and potatoes and fish stock and the herbs. Num num. I think that needs a little bit of salt, and I think a little bit more pepper. A little bit of pepper there. And I like to use this kosher salt. I'm going to put in about, I don't know, a good pinch. And then we'll taste it again. Always using, of course, a clean tasting spoon at every time. Now, as to fish, you can use all one kind, but I like a mixture, just as you do in bouillabaisse, because it's more interesting. Of course, the Pilgrims just used cod, because that's all they had. There's a nice cod fillet called a scrod, and this is haddock. You can tell haddock because it has a salt and pepper color. It has this big black line. You take the skin off and cut it into chunks. There's a piece of halibut. You take the skin and the bones off of that, and that could go into your fish stock. Or you could use these nice bits which are cheeks and tongues of cod. That's a very New England thing. So I'll save these for another chowder and put it in the refrigerator. And I want to show you the origin of chowder, which is this great big iron pot, which weighs about 4 tons. And this was originally in the old country called a chaudière, or cauldron. And in the old days, because it has feet, they put it in the ashes and you cooked all kinds of things in it. But for some reason, chowder always means a fish soup. And this beautiful cast iron pot came from the Wayside Inn in Sudbury, Massachusetts. And Longfellow slept there and wrote whatever he wrote. What was it? Tales of a Wayside Inn. So that's a historic pot. Maybe he even ate a chowder out of it. But when this is done, I'm going to ladle it into a nice big hot tureen. And this is getting to be done now. Can you see how that looks there? Of course, this is a luxurious chowder because we have all this fresh fish in it. And fish has gotten, unfortunately, quite expensive. But if you have big, meaty fish frames, you can cook them just about 2 or 3 minutes, take the meat off of them and save it, and then finish cooking the fish stock and then use that meat in your chowder. In other words, with the onions and potatoes and salt pork and the good fish stock, you really can get along without fish. You could call that a poor man's chowder. I'm going to see how well this is done. As you see, this really has only cooked about 2 or 3 minutes. It's still a little tiny bit squashy, but it doesn't really need more than a minute. I'm going to taste it again just to make sure that everything is absolutely perfect. It's delicious. I think fish chowder is really one of my very favorite meals. We'll just keep watching it. And one thing also about it is once it's cooked and ready, you can let it cool off and let it completely get cold, and then cover it and refrigerate it, and it very often is even better the next day. And another thing about There's my... About doing things ahead, you could do the whole chowder base ahead and put the fish in at the last moment. But now it is ready, and I'm going to ladle it into my tureen, and we're going to eat it. Funny that in other countries they don't seem to make this kind of a chowder. We were in Norway, and I made a chowder for some friends of ours, and they'd never had one before. And they have all of the ingredients, of course. They've got cod, and they have potatoes. Heaven knows they've got potatoes in Norway. And they have plenty of salt pork, but it's just not something that they make. You see how she's going there. There. And now it's ready to serve. Now, with this, you could serve white wine or cider. I like either one myself. Of course, the Pilgrims, I imagine, would have had cider. So here we go with our fish chowder. The first person is going to get a bay leaf, which is very nice. And I like to serve it in big, wide dishes like that. And then if you're going to be very traditional, you can serve what they call common crackers or a pilot biscuit with it. But I like to be rather untraditional. I like a big dollop of sour cream and a bit of parsley. That gives it a little more color. And rather than crackers, I like toasted, homemade croutons that have been tossed in butter. I think that makes a lovely chowder, particularly when it's for a main course. And then you can have side dishes of a very fine homemade coleslaw. That's a very American accompaniment. And then for dessert, we have our Indian pudding. And look at that wonderfully caramel brown, beautiful stuff. And you can serve that with whipped cream, but I like to have it with a big plop of vanilla ice cream, and that's about the best kind of early American dessert you can think of. As a matter of fact, I come from California. I never even had heard of Indian pudding until I came to New England. And the first one I had was in an Armenian restaurant in Lexington, Massachusetts. And now I'm an addict. So that's all for today. This is Julia Child. Bon appetit.
Next on Channel 2, The Victory Garden. And more good cooking with Jeff Smith, the Frugal Gourmet at 5. Barbecue today. Stay tuned.
Julia Child is author of the book Julia Child,